The story begins not with gunfire, but with desperation. In the spring of 1939, across the ports and railway stations of Britain, a quiet exodus was reaching its final stages. Young men, some barely teenagers, arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and names that marked them as foreign. They were German, Austrian, Czech. They were Jews who had escaped Hitler's expanding Reich by mere weeks, sometimes days. Their families had scraped together every penny, called in every favor, pulled every string to get their sons out. Most would never see their parents again. These refugees found themselves in a country that welcomed them, yet viewed them with suspicion. When war broke out in September 1939, Britain's policy was clear and harsh. Enemy aliens. It didn't matter that they had fled Nazi persecution. Their passports said German or Austrian, and so they were interned. By mid-1940, thousands of German and Austrian refugees, the very people who had the most reason to hate Hitler, found themselves behind barbed wire on the Isle of Man, in camps that looked remarkably similar to the ones they had escaped. But in the corridors of British military intelligence, a different conversation was taking place. In 1940, Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark of the British Commandos had a radical idea. These refugees weren't just victims. They were potential weapons. They spoke fluent German. They knew German culture, customs, and psychology intimately. They had every reason to fight with a ferocity that no ordinary British soldier could match, and they were being wasted in internment camps. Clark's vision would eventually materialize as number 3 Troop, 10 Commando, better known by its unofficial designation, XTroop. It would become one of the most unusual and deadly special forces units of World War II. The recruitment began quietly in late 1942. Word spread through the internment camps and refugee communities. The British Army was looking for volunteers for hazardous duties. No details were provided. The requirements were simple but specific. German or Austrian nationals, physically fit and willing to do whatever it took to defeat the Nazis. Among the first to volunteer was a young man named Manfred Ganz. Born in Borken, Germany in 1922, Ganz had watched his synagogue burn during Kristallnacht. His father, a decorated World War I veteran who had fought for Germany, couldn't believe his country would truly turn on its Jewish citizens. But Manfred knew better. In 1938, at age 16, he was sent alone to Britain. He would never see his parents again. They would perish in Auschwitz. When the call came for volunteers, Ganz didn't hesitate. He later wrote, "I wanted to kill Nazis. It was that simple. They had taken everything from me, my family, my home, my country. The only thing I had left was the chance to fight back." Another volunteer was Peter Masters, born Peter Arany in Vienna. His family had fled Austria the day after the Anschluss in 1938. Masters was a brilliant linguist, speaking German, Hungarian, and English fluently. He understood that this war would not be won by conventional means alone. "We had something no British commando could ever have," he later recalled. "We could walk through Germany and be invisible. We were the enemy, hiding inside the enemy." The man chosen to lead this unprecedented unit was Captain Brian Hilton Jones, a regular British Army officer with no Jewish background whatsoever. It was a deliberate choice. The British command structure needed someone who could interface with the traditional military establishment while commanding these unconventional warriors. But Hilton Jones proved to be more than just a figurehead. He understood what his men had lost, and he gave them something in return: purpose. Training began at Aberdofi in Wales in the summer of 1943. It was brutal by design. The men of XTroop would not be ordinary commandos. They would be elite raiders, saboteurs, and intelligence gatherers. They learned close-quarters combat, explosives, amphibious assault, parachuting, and interrogation techniques. They practiced until they could strip and reassemble German weapons blindfolded. They memorized German military ranks, unit structures, and radio protocols. But the most crucial part of their training was the cover story. Every man in XTroop was given a new identity. Their German Jewish names were replaced with British ones. Manfred Ganz became Fred Gray. Peter Arani became Peter Masters. Hans Hyos became Terry Hall. They were issued false identity papers, complete with fabricated British birthplaces and backgrounds. The reason was coldly practical. If captured, these men faced certain torture and execution. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war had some protection, but Jewish commandos, fighting in German uniforms or with German weapons, would be classified as spies and saboteurs. The Nazis would show no mercy. Each man was given a choice: keep your real name and risk everything, or take a British identity and have a slim chance of survival if captured. Every single member of XTroop chose the British name. They would fight as ghosts, their true identities known only to their brothers in arms. By late 1943, XTroop numbered approximately 87 men. They came from across the German-speaking world: Berlin and Vienna, Prague and Budapest. Some were university students, others had been shopkeepers or tailors, a few had been lawyers or doctors in training. Now they were all the same, soldiers with a single purpose. The question was no longer who they were, but what they would become. In the cold Welsh wind, as they practiced beach assaults and nighttime raids, these men were being forged into something unprecedented. They were Jewish refugees who would return to Nazi-occupied Europe not as victims, but as hunters. They would land on the beaches of Normandy, parachute into Germany, and operate behind enemy lines with a cold efficiency born of personal loss. Their story was about to begin in earnest, and it would be written in the shadows, in languages their enemies thought were their own, by men who had every reason to show no mercy, but would prove themselves to be among the most professional and disciplined soldiers of the war. The world had tried to destroy them. They would return the favor. June 6, 1944, 0630 hours, Sword Beach, Normandy. The landing craft lurched through the Grey Channel waters, packed tight with men whose faces showed nothing but grim determination. Among them were members of XTroop, attached to various commando units for the largest amphibious invasion in history. They had trained for this moment for over a year. Now, as the French coast materialized through the dawn mist and German shells began to churn the water around them, the reality of war was about to become brutally clear. Sergeant Peter Masters, formerly Peter Arani of Vienna, crouched in a landing craft heading toward Ouistreham, attached to 41 Commando. The craft's ramp dropped, and immediately machine gun fire raked across the bow. Men fell before they touched the sand. Masters splashed into chest-deep water, his equipment weighing him down, bullets snapping past his head. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times during training. Nothing had prepared him for the chaos. The noise was indescribable, Masters later wrote in his memoirs. Shells, machine guns, men screaming orders that couldn't be heard. I kept thinking in German. My brain defaulted to my native language in stress, and I had to consciously force myself to think in English. One slip of the tongue, and my own men might shoot me as a German infiltrator. XTroop's role on D-Day was unique and critical. While other commandos had objectives like capturing bridges or fortified positions, the XTroop men had an additional mission: intelligence gathering. They were to capture German prisoners, seize documents, interrogate officers on the spot, and relay tactical information back to headquarters. Their fluent German and intimate knowledge of Wehrmacht procedures made them invaluable. Corporal George Lane, born Georg Lany in Budapest, landed with 10 commando at Lyon-sur-Mer. His unit's objective was to push inland and link up with British airborne forces. But Lane had a more immediate problem. A German strongpoint was pinning down the entire beach. Lane crawled through the surf to a destroyed Churchill tank, using it for cover. From there, he spotted the German machine gun nest, a reinforced concrete bunker that Allied naval bombardment had somehow missed. He pulled a phosphorus grenade from his webbing. The distance was too far for an accurate throw, but Lane had played handball in Budapest. He stood, exposed himself completely, and hurled the grenade in a perfect arc. It sailed through the bunker's firing slit. The explosion was followed by screaming. In German, 3 Wehrmacht soldiers stumbled out, their uniforms burning. British commandos cut them down immediately, but Lane rushed forward, yelling in English, "Hold fire! Hold fire! I need one alive!" He grabbed the least wounded German, a young private who couldn't have been more than 19, and dragged him behind the tank. In perfect German, Lane demanded, "What unit? How many? Where are the reserves?" The terrified soldier, assuming Lane was a German officer, spilled everything. His unit was the 716th Infantry Division, undermanned and filled with conscripts from occupied territories. The real threat wasn't on the beach. It was 2 kilometers inland, where the 21st Panzer Division was assembling for a counterattack. Lane relayed this information immediately. Within minutes, it reached divisional headquarters. Naval guns adjusted their fire, and Allied fighters were vectored toward the German armor concentration. Lane's 5-minute interrogation had potentially saved hundreds of lives, but not all of XTroop's D-Day experiences ended in success. Private Colin Anson, formerly Klaus Ascher from Berlin, landed with 45 Commando at Juno Beach alongside Canadian forces. Anson was just 22 years old, a brilliant student who had been studying chemistry at University College London before volunteering. His parents had gotten him out of Germany in 1939. They remained behind and were deported to Theresienstadt in 1942. Anson's section was tasked with clearing a coastal village called Langrune-sur-Mer. The Germans had fortified it heavily, turning stone houses into miniature fortresses. As the commandos moved through the narrow streets, a sniper's bullet struck Anson in the chest. He fell in a doorway, blood spreading across his battle dress. His section commander, Lieutenant Hugh Pettigrew, crawled to him. Anson was still conscious, struggling to breathe. In his final moments, he said something in German, not English. Pettigrew didn't speak German, but he held Anson's hand until he died. It was only later, when Pettigrew learned that Anson was from XTroop, that he understood. In his dying moment, Colin Anson had reverted to the language of his childhood, perhaps calling for parents he would never see again. Anson became one of the first XTroop casualties of D-Day. He would not be the last. By nightfall, on June 6th, the Allies had secured a fragile foothold in France. XTroop members were scattered across the invasion beaches, attached to different commando units. Their contribution was already measurable: over 30 German prisoners captured and interrogated, providing crucial intelligence about German defensive positions, minefields, and counterattack plans. But the invasion was just the beginning. As Allied forces pushed inland, XTroop's mission evolved. They became the experts in interrogating prisoners, translating captured documents, and operating behind enemy lines in German uniform, a violation of the Geneva Convention that could result in immediate execution if caught. Sergeant Fred Gray, Manfred Gans, found himself attached to a forward reconnaissance unit pushing toward Caen. The city was supposed to fall on D-Day. Instead, it became a brutal stalemate. German resistance was fiercer than expected, anchored by SS panzer divisions that had been held in reserve. Gray's unit captured a German lieutenant from the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth Division, composed of fanatical teenagers and young men. The lieutenant was arrogant, refusing to provide any information beyond his name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention. Gray sat down across from him and spoke in flawless German. "I know who you are. 12th SS. You're not regular Wehrmacht. You're true believers. That's fine. I'm not here to make you betray your comrades." The German officer's eyes narrowed. "You speak German like a native. Where are you from?" Gray smiled coldly. "Berlin. Charlottenburg district. I left in 1938 because your Führer decided my family wasn't German enough. My parents didn't get out. They were sent to Auschwitz in 1942. So when I ask you questions, understand something. I don't care about the Geneva Convention. I don't care about military courtesy. I will get the information I need, one way or another." It was a bluff. Gray would never actually torture a prisoner. But the psychological effect was immediate. The German officer, suddenly realizing he was being interrogated by a German Jew who had every personal reason to hate him, began to talk. This became XTroop's most potent weapon, not violence, but psychological understanding. They knew how German soldiers thought, what they feared, what motivated them. They could speak to Wehrmacht conscripts as fellow Germans, appealing to their desire to survive. They could confront SS fanatics with the reality of Jewish soldiers who had returned to destroy the Reich. And they could identify which prisoners were worth interrogating and which were merely following orders. As June turned to July, the battle for Normandy ground on. Ex-troop members operated in small teams, often detached from their parent units, moving wherever intelligence was needed. They infiltrated German lines, dressed in Wehrmacht uniforms, listened to communications, and brought back invaluable information. But the psychological toll was mounting. These men were fighting in the country their families had fled to, against soldiers who spoke their native language in a landscape soaked with blood. Some nights, listening to German radio intercepts, they would hear accents from their hometowns, Berlin, Vienna, Munich, and remember that they were killing people who might have been their neighbors, their classmates, their friends in another life. Peter Masters wrote in his diary during this period, "I killed a German soldier today. He couldn't have been older than 18. As he died, he called for his mother. Mutti, he said. The same word I used as a child. I felt nothing. I should feel something, shouldn't I? But there's nothing left inside me except the mission. Perhaps that's what we've become. Machines that speak German and kill Germans. Perhaps that's what we had to become." By the end of June 1944, XTroop had proven its worth beyond any doubt. They had captured or interrogated over 200 German soldiers, provided intelligence that shaped tactical decisions, and operated with a professionalism that earned respect from even skeptical regular British Army officers. But the hardest missions were still to come. As the Allies prepared to break out from Normandy and drive toward Germany itself, XTroop would be called upon for increasingly dangerous operations, missions that would take them deep behind enemy lines into the heart of the Reich, hunting for intelligence and hunting for revenge. The beaches of Normandy were just the beginning. The real war for the men of XTroop was about to begin. August 1944. The breakout from Normandy was underway. After 2 months of brutal attritional warfare in the Norman hedgerows, Allied forces finally shattered German defenses at Operation Cobra. American tanks poured through the gap at Avranches, while British and Canadian forces pushed toward Falaise, threatening to encircle the entire German 7th Army. The Wehrmacht was in retreat, disorganized, desperate, and dangerous. For XTroop, this chaos created both opportunities and extraordinary risks. As German forces fell back toward the Reich, the need for tactical intelligence became critical. Allied commanders needed to know: were the Germans preparing defensive lines? Where were their supply dumps? Which roads were mined? What units were still combat effective? Traditional reconnaissance could answer some questions, but only XTroop could walk into a German position, speak the language, read the documents, and walk back out alive. Lieutenant Peter Masters received his orders in mid-August. His mission was deceptively simple: penetrate German lines near Argentan, locate elements of the retreating 2nd SS Panzer Division das Reich, determine their strength and destination, and return with intelligence. He would operate in German uniform, a grey Wehrmacht tunic with corporal's insignia, carrying forged papers identifying him as a dispatch rider. Under the Hague Conventions and Geneva Conventions, combatants caught fighting in enemy uniform could be executed as spies. Masters knew the risks. Every XTroop member did. They had signed documents acknowledging that they were volunteers for missions that exceeded the normal bounds of military duty. "I wasn't afraid of dying," Masters later recalled. "I was afraid of being captured alive." We all carried cyanide capsules, standard issue for XTroop on deep penetration missions. The capsule was sewn into the collar of our uniforms. If captured by the SS, you had perhaps 30 seconds to bite down before they found it. That's how long you had to choose between a quick death and whatever the Gestapo had planned. Masters set out on foot at dusk, moving through the shattered French countryside. The summer of 1944 had turned Normandy into a landscape of destruction. Burned-out tanks, dead horses bloating in the August heat, entire villages reduced to rubble. He moved carefully, avoiding main roads, until he heard what he was looking for: German voices. A column of Wehrmacht troops was moving east in the darkness, walking wounded, supply wagons, a few half-tracks. Masters took a breath, adjusted his German uniform, and stepped onto the road. "Halt! Identify yourself." A German sergeant materialized from the shadows, rifle raised. Masters responded in perfect German: "Corporal Müller, dispatch rider, 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. I've been separated from my unit. Who are you?" The sergeant lowered his rifle slightly. "2nd SS Panzer, we're pulling back to Vimoutiers. Where the hell is the 17th? "Scattered," Masters replied, his voice weary and bitter, the tone of every German soldier in August 1944. "The Americans broke through yesterday. My motorcycle was hit by fighter bombers. I've been walking for 2 days." The sergeant nodded sympathetically. "Fighter bombers everywhere. The Luftwaffe is nowhere. Join us. We're moving east. Maybe you can find your unit." And just like that, Peter Masters, a Jewish refugee from Vienna, was marching with an SS Panzer Division, surrounded by the very soldiers whose organization had murdered his family. For the next 6 hours, Masters walked with the German column. He listened to their conversations, noted their unit designations, assessed their morale. The Germans talked freely. They assumed everyone around them was German. They complained about Allied air superiority, about fuel shortages, about wondering if the war was lost. Some were defiant, vowing to defend the Reich to the last. Others were simply exhausted, hoping to survive long enough to see their families again. At one point, a young SS officer approached Masters. "You look familiar, Corporal. Where are you from?" Masters felt his heart rate spike, but kept his voice steady. "Cologne. And you, Herr Obersturmführer?" "Munich. I was at university there before the war. You have the bearing of an educated man, unusual for an enlisted man." "I studied engineering," Masters replied, fabricating details. "The war interrupted my education." The officer nodded. "The same for all of us. When we win, we'll rebuild. Germany will be greater than ever." Masters said nothing. What could he say? That Germany had already lost? That this officer would likely be dead within months? That the Reich this man believed in had built factories of death to exterminate people like Masters? Instead, he simply nodded and moved away, filing the conversation into his mental notes. At dawn, as the column approached Vimoutiers, Masters saw his opportunity. The Germans were setting up a temporary bivouac, dispersing into the woods for rest. Masters volunteered for guard duty, a natural choice for someone who had supposedly just joined the column. He was assigned to a forward position at the edge of the woods. He waited until the guard rotation changed, then simply walked away. By the time anyone noticed Corporal Miller was missing, if they ever did, Masters was 3 kilometers away, back in Allied territory, delivering a complete intelligence breakdown to his commanders. His report was devastating for the Germans. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich was down to approximately 40% combat effectiveness. They had fewer than 30 operational tanks. Their fuel situation was critical. They were siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles. Morale was mixed, with hardline SS officers maintaining discipline, while ordinary soldiers increasingly doubted final victory. Most critically, they were retreating toward Vimoutiers and then planning to establish defensive positions along the Seine River. This intelligence reached the American Third Army within hours. General George S. Patton's tanks adjusted their advance, cutting off the German retreat route. The remnants of Das Reich would be mauled in the Falaise pocket, where tens of thousands of German soldiers would be killed or captured in one of the war's most decisive encirclements. Peter Masters had walked among the enemy for 6 hours and changed the course of a battle. But not every XTroop mission ended in success. In September 1944, during Operation Market Garden, the ambitious Allied attempt to capture bridges in Holland and drive into Germany, XTroop members were attached to British airborne forces. Their mission was to interrogate captured Germans and gather intelligence about enemy positions around Arnhem. Sergeant Tony Firth, formerly Hans Freud from Berlin, parachuted into Holland with the 1st Airborne Division. The operation was a disaster from the beginning. British paratroopers landed too far from their objectives. German resistance was far stronger than intelligence had predicted. 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem, something Allied planners had dismissed as impossible. Firth found himself trapped with the remnants of the 1st Airborne in a shrinking perimeter around Oosterbeek. The British were surrounded, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. For 9 days, they held out, hoping for relief that never came. On the 8th day, Firth was wounded by shrapnel from an 88mm shell. British medics treated him in a cellar that served as a makeshift aid station. German forces were closing in, and everyone knew the position would be overrun within hours. The medical officer, Captain James Logan, approached Firth. "Sergeant, you're XTroop, aren't you?" Firth nodded, understanding immediately what Logan was asking. If captured, XTroop members faced special danger. Logan handed him a British uniform tunic. "Your German papers, destroy them now. You're a regular British paratrooper, nothing more. If they find out you're XTroop, if they realize you're Jewish and you've been operating behind their lines..." Firth burned his false German identity papers and changed into the British uniform. When German troops overran the position hours later, he was taken prisoner as Sergeant Tony Firth, 1st Airborne Division. His German was too perfect for a British soldier, and the Germans questioned him repeatedly, suspicious, but his papers said he was British, and they had no proof otherwise. He would spend the rest of the war in a POW camp, never revealing his true identity. The cyanide capsule remained sewn in his collar, unused. He survived. Many of his comrades from the 1st Airborne did not. By autumn 1944, as Allied forces approached the German border, XTroop's missions became increasingly audacious. They were sent to kidnap specific German officers for interrogation. They infiltrated German units to assess defensive preparations. They posed as Gestapo agents to access documents and facilities. Corporal Ian Harris, formerly Erich Honigmann from Vienna, conducted a mission in October that became legendary within XTroop. Dressed in Gestapo uniform, complete with forged credentials, he walked into a German military headquarters in occupied Belgium and demanded to see their personnel files and defensive maps, claiming to be conducting a security review. The German officers, terrified of the Gestapo, handed over everything. Harris spent 2 hours reviewing documents, making notes before declaring the security review complete and walking out. He returned to Allied lines with detailed maps of German defensive positions along the Siegfried Line, the Westwall fortifications protecting Germany's western border. "The Germans' own paranoia was our greatest weapon," Harris later reflected. "They were so afraid of their own secret police that they never questioned whether a Gestapo officer was genuine. We exploited that fear ruthlessly, but the closer they got to Germany, the more personal the war became. These men were approaching the country of their birth, the land that had expelled them, the place where their families had been murdered. The emotional weight was crushing." Fred Gray, Manfred Gans, wrote in a letter to a friend, "We're less than 100 kilometers from the German border now. Soon, I'll be back in Germany, the country I was born in, the country that tried to exterminate my people. I don't know what I'll feel when I cross that border. Rage, satisfaction, emptiness, perhaps all three, or perhaps nothing at all. War has a way of burning out your feelings until only duty remains." As 1944 drew to a close, XTroop stood on the threshold of Germany itself. They had survived D-Day, operated behind enemy lines across France and Belgium, and proven themselves among the most effective intelligence-gathering units in the Allied arsenal. Now they would return to the Reich, not as refugees, not as victims, but as conquerors. The final act of their war was about to begin, and it would take them into the darkest heart of Nazi Germany, where the evidence of what had been done to their families would become impossible to ignore. March 23, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. The barrier that had protected Germany for 1,000 years was about to fall. The Rhine, wide, swift, heavily defended, represented the last major natural obstacle between the Allied armies and the heart of the Third Reich. For the men of XTroop, crossing this river meant something more than military strategy. It meant returning to the country that had tried to destroy them. Operation Plunder, the massive Allied crossing of the Rhine, involved over 1 million troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and the largest airborne operation since D-Day. British, American, and Canadian forces would storm across the river at multiple points while paratroopers seized the far bank. XTroop members were scattered among various commando and airborne units, each with specific intelligence missions. Sergeant Fred Gray, Manfred Ganz from Borken, crossed the Rhine near Wessel with 45 commando. As his landing craft approached the eastern bank under heavy German fire, Gray experienced something he hadn't expected, a crushing wave of emotion. He was back in Germany, the country of his childhood, the country that had murdered his parents. "I could smell Germany," Gray later recalled. "It sounds absurd, but there's a particular smell to German earth, German forests, German towns. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it until that moment. And then immediately, I hated myself for missing it. This country had taken everything from me. I had no right to feel anything but rage." The crossing was chaotic. German defenders, a mixture of Wehrmacht regulars, Volkssturm militia, and teenage Hitler youth, fought with desperate ferocity. They knew they were defending German soil now, not occupied territory. Surrender meant invasion. Resistance meant protecting their families. Gray's commando unit secured a bridgehead and immediately began clearing nearby villages. The scenes they encountered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. German towns were filled with displaced persons, forced laborers, and refugees fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. Among them were concentration camp survivors, skeletal figures in striped uniforms, barely alive, speaking in a babel of languages. Gray approached a group of survivors and addressed them in German. "You're safe now. The British Army is here. Who are you? Where are you from?" An elderly man, his eyes hollow with suffering, stared at Gray's British uniform in confusion. "You speak German like us. Are you German?" "I was," Gray replied quietly. "I'm Jewish. I left in 1938. I came back." The old man began to weep. Others gathered around, touching Gray's uniform as if to confirm he was real. These were the people the Nazis had tried to erase from existence. And here was one of them, returned as a British soldier. But there was no time for emotion. Gray's mission was clear: locate German military installations, interrogate prisoners, and identify which enemy units were still combat effective. The war was not yet over. Across the Rhine, other XTroop members were conducting similar operations. Lieutenant Peter Masters, now attached to a Special Air Service SAS unit, was operating deep behind German lines in the industrial Ruhr region. His mission was to locate and assess German ammunition dumps before Allied forces arrived. Masters infiltrated the town of Essen, dressed in civilian clothes, a risky choice, as civilians caught with weapons were immediately executed as partisans. But it allowed him to move freely. The Third Reich was collapsing, and in the chaos, nobody questioned one more displaced person among thousands. He spoke with local Germans, maintaining the fiction that he was a refugee from the Eastern Front. What he learned was disturbing. The Nazi regime was preparing for werewolf operations, partisan resistance that would continue even after military defeat. Arms caches were being hidden. Fanatical SS and Hitler Youth members were being organized into stay-behind cells. The war might continue for months, even years, as an insurgency. Masters relayed this intelligence to his commanders. Allied forces adjusted their occupation plans accordingly, prioritizing the capture of suspected werewolf leaders and weapons caches. The insurgency that Hitler had hoped for never fully materialized, partly because Allied intelligence, gathered by men like Masters, allowed them to preemptively disrupt the resistance networks. But the deeper XTroop penetrated into Germany, the more they confronted the full horror of what the Reich had done. In early April 1945, elements of XTroop attached to the British 11th Armoured Division approached Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany. The camp had not been evacuated. There was nowhere left to send the prisoners. When British forces liberated it on April 15th, they found approximately 60,000 prisoners, most dying of starvation and typhus. Tens of thousands of corpses lay unburied. Sergeant George Lane, Georg Lanyi from Budapest, was among the first XTroop members to enter Belsen. Nothing in his training, nothing in 3 years of combat, had prepared him for what he witnessed. The smell reached us half a kilometer before we saw the camp, Lane later testified. Then we saw them, human beings reduced to skeletons, barely able to walk, bodies stacked like cordwood, and the survivors, their eyes, they looked at us without hope. They'd been liberated, but many were so far gone that liberation came too late. Lane and other XTroop members immediately began organizing relief efforts. Their fluency in German, Yiddish, Hungarian, Czech, and other languages made them invaluable in communicating with survivors and coordinating with aid organizations. But the emotional toll was devastating. Lane walked through the camp, searching for anyone from his hometown, anyone from his family. He found Hungarian Jews among the survivors, people who might have known his parents. One woman, barely conscious, told him that his mother and father had been deported to Auschwitz in 1944. They had not survived. Lane sat down in the mud of Bergen-Belsen and wept. He was a British commando, a decorated soldier who had fought from Normandy to the Rhine without breaking. But seeing the evidence of what had been done to his people destroyed something inside him. We had suspected, he later wrote. We had heard rumors. But seeing it, smelling it, touching the hands of survivors, that made it real. This was what we had been fighting against. This was why our war had to be fought without mercy. The discovery of the concentration camps transformed XTroop's mission. They were no longer just intelligence gatherers and commandos. They became witnesses, investigators, prosecutors. XTroop members were attached to war crimes investigation units, using their language skills to interrogate camp guards and administrators. Their intimate knowledge of German culture and Nazi ideology made them uniquely effective at breaking through the lies and denials. Corporal Ian Harris, Erich Honigmann, interrogated an SS guard from Belsen who claimed he was just following orders and had no choice. Harris responded coldly in German, "I'm Jewish. I left Germany in 1938. My family stayed behind. They believed Germany was still civilized, that the madness would pass. They were wrong. My parents died in Sobibor. My sister died in Auschwitz. My grandmother died in Theresienstadt. You had a choice. Every day you had a choice. You chose to participate in mass murder. There's no excuse for what you did. None." The guard broke down, confessing to atrocities in detail. His testimony would later be used in war crimes trials. As April turned to May, the Reich was in its death throes. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. German forces were surrendering by the hundreds of thousands. The war in Europe was clearly ending. For XTroop, the final weeks brought a strange mixture of triumph and emptiness. They had survived. They had contributed significantly to Allied victory. They had returned to Germany not as victims, but as conquerors. But victory felt hollow when measured against what had been lost. Fred Gray stood in the ruins of Borken, his hometown, in late April. The synagogue, where he had prayed as a child, was gone, burned during Kristallnacht, and never rebuilt. His family's home had been seized and given to a Nazi party member. The Jewish cemetery was desecrated, headstones smashed. He knocked on the door of his former home. A German woman answered, her face pale with fear. "Please, I didn't know. My husband got this house from the government. We didn't know what happened to the previous owners." Gray looked past her, into the house where he had grown up. "I know what happened to them," he said quietly in German. "They were my parents. They were sent to Auschwitz in 1942. They died there." The woman began to cry, stammering apologies. Gray turned and walked away. There was nothing more to say. His parents were gone. His childhood was gone. The Germany he had known, perhaps it had never truly existed. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. Victory in Europe, VE Day. Across Britain and America, people celebrated in the streets. For XTroop, scattered across occupied Germany, the celebrations were more subdued. Peter Masters spent VE Day in a temporary barracks in Lüneburg. He wrote in his diary, "The war is over. We won. But what did we win? I'm alive, but my family is dead. I have a British name and a British uniform, but I'll never be truly British. I can never go back to being Austrian. Austria doesn't exist anymore, and even if it did, there's nothing there for me. I'm a ghost, a man without a country, without a family, without a past. We won the war, but I feel like I've lost everything that mattered." It was a sentiment echoed by many XTroop members. They had proven themselves as soldiers. They had helped defeat the greatest evil of their generation. But the victory could not bring back what they had lost. Yet their mission was not quite finished. As the shooting war ended, a new phase began. The reckoning. War crimes trials, denazification, the reconstruction of Europe. And XTroop would play a crucial role in all of it. The men who had fought in the shadows would now step into the light to bear witness to what they had seen and to ensure that the truth of the Holocaust could never be denied. May 1945. Germany, Year Zero. The Third Reich had fallen, but the work of XTroop was far from over. As Europe emerged from 6 years of total war, the scale of Nazi atrocities became undeniable. The concentration camps, the death factories, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, all of it now lay exposed to the world. Someone had to document it. Someone had to make sure the perpetrators were held accountable. Someone had to bear witness. XTroop, with their unique combination of language skills, cultural knowledge, and personal stakes in the outcome, became essential to the Allied war crimes investigations. They were no longer just soldiers. They were witnesses, translators, investigators, and in some cases, the only surviving link to entire communities that had been erased. Lieutenant Peter Masters was assigned to the British Army of the Rhine's War Crimes Investigation Unit in June 1945. His mission was to track down SS officers and camp administrators who had fled or gone into hiding. It was patient, methodical work, checking identity papers, interviewing witnesses, following leads through the chaos of post-war Germany. One afternoon, Masters was checking papers at a displaced persons camp near Hamburg when something caught his attention. A man claiming to be a Wehrmacht private had papers that were too perfect, no smudges, no wear, as if they'd been issued yesterday. Masters' years of handling forged documents made him suspicious. He pulled the man aside and spoke in German. "These papers are fake. Who are you really?" The man maintained his story. Just an ordinary soldier trying to get home. But Masters noticed his hands, soft, uncalloused, not the hands of a soldier who'd spent years in combat. And there was something else, a small mark on his left arm, barely visible. The man had burned off his SS blood group tattoo. "Your SS," Masters said flatly. "Roll up your sleeve." The man's face went white. Under interrogation, he confessed, SS Hauptscharführer Karl Schmidt, formerly a guard at Neuengamme concentration camp. He had been responsible for selecting prisoners for execution. By his own admission, he had sent hundreds to their deaths. Masters felt nothing. No rage, no satisfaction. Just cold professional duty. "You'll be turned over to the War Crimes Tribunal," he said in German. "They'll decide what happens to you." "You're German," Schmidt said desperately. "You understand. I was following orders. What could I do?" Masters looked at him with contempt. "I'm Jewish. I left Germany because of people like you. My family didn't leave. They're dead now, murdered in camps run by people like you. Don't talk to me about following orders. You had choices. You chose to be a murderer." Schmidt would eventually stand trial and be sentenced to life imprisonment. He was one of dozens of war criminals that XTroop members helped identify and capture in the months after the war. But not all of XTroop's post-war work was about prosecution. Much of it was about reunion and reconstruction. Sergeant Fred Gray, Manfred Ganz, spent the summer of 1945 working with Jewish refugee organizations, trying to reunite survivors with family members. It was heartbreaking work. Most searches ended in confirmation of death. But occasionally, there were miracles. In July, Gray was processing a group of survivors from Theresienstadt when a young woman approached him. "You're from Borken, aren't you? I recognize your face. You're Manfred Ganz." Gray stared at her in shock. Hannah Levy. She had been his neighbor, the daughter of his father's business partner. Her entire family had been deported. By all accounts, they should have been dead. "My parents are gone," Hannah said quietly, "but my brother survived. He's in a DP camp in Austria. I thought everyone from home was dead. But you're here. You came back." Gray helped Hannah locate her brother and facilitated their emigration to Palestine. It was one small victory against an ocean of loss, but it mattered. As 1945 progressed, XTroop members faced difficult decisions about their futures. They had been soldiers for 3 years, living under assumed British identities. Now, the war was over. Who were they? Where did they belong? Some chose to remain in Britain, making their assumed identities permanent. Peter Masters stayed. Peter Masters, eventually attending Cambridge University and becoming a successful author and psychologist. His books about his wartime experiences would help preserve XTroop's legacy for future generations. Others reclaimed their original names and identities. George Lane became Georg Lani again, though he kept his British citizenship. He settled in London, married, and spent decades working for reconciliation between Jewish communities and post-war Germany. A significant number emigrated to Palestine, soon to become Israel, joining the fight for Jewish independence. The skills they had learned in XTroop, weapons training, demolitions, intelligence work, made them valuable to the Haganah and later the Israel Defense Forces. Manfred Ganz, Fred Gray, chose a different path. He emigrated to the United States in 1948, settled in New Jersey, and built a successful business career. For decades, he rarely spoke about his wartime service. The memories were too painful, the losses too great. It was only in his later years that he began to share his story, speaking at schools and Holocaust remembrance events. "I wanted people to understand that we didn't go quietly," Ganz told an interviewer in 2005. The Nazis wanted to portray Jews as weak, as passive victims, but we fought back. XTroop proved that. We returned to Germany as soldiers, as warriors. We made them pay for what they'd done. The full story of XTroop remained classified for decades after the war. Many of their operations had involved violations of the Geneva Conventions, fighting in enemy uniforms, conducting espionage, operating behind enemy lines without clear military identification. The British government was reluctant to publicize missions that, while militarily successful, were legally problematic. It wasn't until the 1990s, as the last members of XTroop reached old age, that their story began to emerge publicly. Historians gained access to declassified documents. Survivors published memoirs. The world learned about the remarkable unit of Jewish refugees who had returned to fight the Nazis. The statistics tell part of the story. XTroop conducted hundreds of intelligence-gathering missions across occupied Europe. They interrogated thousands of German prisoners. They provided tactical intelligence that influenced major military decisions. They suffered casualties. 10 men killed in action, several captured, many wounded. But their contribution to Allied victory was disproportionate to their small numbers. But statistics cannot capture the personal cost. Nearly every member of XTroop lost family members in the Holocaust. Parents, siblings, grandparents, cousins, entire branches of family trees were cut down. They fought not just for Britain or for democracy, but for vengeance, for justice, for the memory of the dead. Ian Harris, Erich Honigmann, reflected on this in a 1998 interview, one of the last he gave before his death. People ask if we were heroes. I don't think so. We were angry young men who wanted to hurt the people who had hurt us. The British Army gave us the training and the opportunity. We took it. If that's heroism, fine. But it felt like necessity, like breathing. We couldn't not fight. Our family's murders demanded it. One of the most poignant post-war gatherings occurred in 1995, 50 years after VE Day. A handful of surviving XTroop members reunited in London. They were old men now, in their 70s and 80s, bearing the physical marks of age and the psychological scars of war. Peter Masters, at 75, looked around the room at his old comrades. "We survived," he said simply. "Against all odds, we survived. Our families didn't, but we did, and we made sure the world knew what happened. That's something." Georg Lany raised a glass. To the ones who didn't make it. To our families. To the 6 million. And to us, the ones who came back. They toasted in silence, old warriors remembering a war that had cost them everything and given them nothing except the knowledge that they had fought evil and won. The legacy of XTroop extends beyond their military accomplishments. They represented something profound, the refusal to be victims. In the face of systematic dehumanization and attempted genocide, these men reclaimed their agency. They transformed from refugees into warriors. They returned to the country that had expelled them and helped bring it to its knees. Their story challenges simplistic narratives about the Holocaust. They were not passive victims waiting for liberation. They were active participants in their own liberation, in the liberation of Europe, in the defeat of Nazism. Today, XTroop is remembered in Britain through memorials, documentaries, and historical studies. In 2021, a comprehensive history of the unit by journalist Leah Garrett brought their story to a wider audience. Veterans organizations in Britain and Israel maintain their memory. Schools teach about them as examples of courage and resilience. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is simply this: they survived. They bore witness. They ensured that the truth could not be buried or denied. Manfred Ganz, Fred Gray, lived until 2021, dying at age 98. He was one of the last surviving members of XTroop. In his final years, he spoke frequently about his experiences, always emphasizing one point: we were ordinary people forced to do extraordinary things. We didn't choose to be refugees. We didn't choose to have our families murdered, but we chose to fight back. That choice defined us. Peter Masters died in 2024 at age 97, having spent decades documenting not just XTroop's story, but the broader experience of Jewish refugees in Britain. His final book, published posthumously, ended with this reflection: we were men without countries, fighting for a country that wasn't ours, against a country that was. We spoke the enemy's language better than we spoke English. We knew their culture, their history, their psychology. We used that knowledge to defeat them. But the victory was bittersweet. We won the war, but we lost our families, our homes, our past. We became British, or Israeli, or American, new identities for new lives. But we never forgot who we had been, or what had been done to us. XTroop was our response to genocide, not passive suffering, but active resistance. Not victims, but warriors. That's how we want to be remembered. The men of XTroop were Jewish refugees who became British commandos. They were German and Austrian boys who became British soldiers. They were sons, brothers, friends, most of whom lost everyone they loved to Hitler's madness. But they fought back. They infiltrated enemy lines, gathered intelligence, captured war criminals, and bore witness to history. They proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, resistance was possible, that courage could emerge from despair, that the victims could become victors. Their story is not just about World War II. It's about the resilience of the human spirit, the power of determination, and the refusal to surrender in the face of evil. The Third Reich promised to erase the Jewish people from Europe. XTroop's answer was simple: we're still here. We fought. We survived. We remember. And because they remembered, we remember. The story of XTroop, Jewish refugees who fought the Nazis from behind enemy lines, will endure as long as we refuse to forget what they sacrificed, what they achieved, and what they represented. They were warriors born of tragedy, soldiers forged by loss, heroes who never sought glory, only justice. This was XTroop. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.